Biotech is, of course, an exciting and dynamic area, and so we are delighted to welcome a panel of CEOs to help us navigate the biotech landscape. While the speakers will introduce themselves in more detail before their presentation, I will give you a brief outline of what we have planned for today. I will shortly be handing over to Dr. Julia Schuler, the owner and founder of Bioaspekte, who will present an introduction to today's topic. We will then hear from James Graham, CEO of Rexy Pharmaceuticals, Mark Diamond, Managing Director and CEO of Antisense Therapeutics, Mark Voigt, CEO and Executive Director of Immutep, and Dr. Mohit Shaya, the co-founder and CEO of Bellaseno. After their presentations, Dr. Lucia Santosa will moderate a Q&A session. Lucia is, of course, an incoming board member of the German-Australian Business Council and works in the biotech area for Cytel. The event will conclude with a vote of thanks by fellow board member, Ms. Perot-Ten. Before I now hand over to Julia, I've been asked to address some minor housekeeping points, which are also on the screen now, or should be momentarily. Please note that the Chatham House rule applies to this webinar, which means that any statements that are made today cannot be attributed to anyone. This webinar will be recorded and made available upon request. All participants have been muted. As we would like this to be as close to a roundtable as possible, and for easier discussion, of course, we would ask that you keep your videos on if possible. While we have already received a range of questions in advance, we would encourage you to put your questions in the chat. And please, if you could send them directly to Lucia as the moderator, that way it will be a lot easier to distinguish them from just general comments and saying hellos and welcomes. So during the Q&A, Lucia may then invite you to unmute and ask your question personally. So now we look forward to hearing from the speakers, and I will hand over to Dr. Julia Schuler for her introductory remarks and an overview of the biotech industry. Julia, please lead us away.
Okay, so thank you. Good morning to everybody all over the world. My name is Julia Schuler. I'm a biologist with a further education in business administration, and I did my PhD in technology management, so I left the laboratory. I'm currently working as a freelancer and I'm analyzing the development of the German biotech industry since about 30 years. And 10 years, nearly 10 years I spent with EY, Ernst & Young, as an industry analyst covering Germany, but also Europe and the US. Today I would like to give you a short biotech market overview. So 5 minutes is quite short for that. But as an introduction, and I would, and as already mentioned in the invitation, the biotech industry nowadays gained huge attention in the past 2 years due to the pandemic. So it's not a nice background, but it really brought a lot of attention for the industry, also in the financing sector. And with the industry is now nearly 50 years old, with Genentech being the first founded in the US in 1974. There are a dozen large leading companies with regard to revenues, and they together account for the majority of the industry revenues, which is about 120 billion US dollar. This already including Moderna and Biotech for the past year. My experience is there's always a discussion on who is the biotech industry. And my view is, so for example, if I mentioned 120 billion worldwide revenues, is excluding traditional pharma companies such as Bristol Myers or Pfizer, which are seen sometimes as biopharma, for example, in market reports. And they became such kind of biopharma companies. They all do or apply biotechnology today, but they came there via acquisitions. And to name a few of these leading companies is, so as a rank of revenues, Gilead, Amgen, Regeneron, which all were founded in the 80s. And to name a few of these large names which were acquired, I already mentioned Genentech, which is integrated into Roche and is responsible for their successful antibody development. Or, for example, Celgene, Medarex, which were acquired by Bristol Myers. Or, for example, Alexion and Medimune, which were acquired by AstraZeneca. In Australia, there's one leading large company, CSL Behring, which was incorporated in 1991 and listed at the Australian Stock Exchange in 1994. They acquired in 2004 Aventis Behring, so the German Behring Werke, which developed vaccines. So this is also one of the focus of CSL Behring today, together with rare diseases. The company has $9 billion revenues and the market cap end of December of nearly $100 billion. But today, our spotlight is on 4 selected Australian life science companies, smaller ones, 3 from the area of biotech, 1 from the area of medical devices. And I think it's a good selection because there are 3 trending biotech sectors addressed. So namely infectious diseases, and we all experience the still huge medical need in this field, not only from viral infections, but also from bacterial infections. And Recce is focusing also on sepsis. So James Braham, who will be the following speaker, will focus on that. We have Antisense Therapeutics. This is interesting because it's also belonging to the research field of RNA or RNA therapeutics. And we have Immutep, who is focusing on immuno-oncology, also a very, very trending field. And last but not least, there is Bellaseno with, they are focusing on tissue engineering. And as I mentioned, later I would like to discuss in the discussion maybe also more biotech financing conditions, because 2 of the companies here are listed at the Frankfurt Stock Exchange as well. And I think this is a very good, very good sign also for the German Frankfurt market. But this we could discuss later, and I would like to hand over to James Braham from Recce Pharma.
Hi, Julia. Good to be with you, and thank you for that introduction. My name is James Graham, CEO and Managing Director of ASX-listed and Frankfurt Stock Exchange-listed Recce Pharmaceuticals Limited. What is Recce really about? Recce is an infectious disease company in the midst of a global infectious disease crisis. I have the privileged position of being able to communicate what is really a sum of all parts. A sum of all parts by way of a technology that was invented by former head of research of Johnson & Johnson Australasia of a decade. He was executive director of their board, who really looked at the antibiotic landscape as a challenged business model and terribly underperforming products by way of bacteria continuing to mutate and antibiotics simply not keeping up. So the fundamental of our company and technology is the invention of Dr. Melrose of formerly Johnson & Johnson in his retirement, where I stepped in as the passive investor supporting a energetic scientist, getting it into the laboratory, proving out through the preclinical sides, efficacy, safety, pharmacokinetics, pharmacology, all your typical IND enabling studies. At the stage, I should take us a few steps back of during the preclinicals, we listed on the Australian Stock Exchange. I was executive director for 5 years. And in the last 18 months, I've transitioned to CEO. As the founding investor, investing in almost every capital round to date, I'm aligned with our shareholders. I'm the second largest shareholder, in fact, and the company really at this stage is at that pivotal time where those preclinical candidates have advanced to clinical candidates. That particularly is sepsis, septicemia, or blood poisoning. For those who don't know, that's where bacteria gets in, you get a break in the skin, bacteria gets in, and every hour left untreated, the likelihood of survival decreases by 8% each hour, and hence is the #1 most expensive condition treated in health at around 50 million patients worldwide each year. and an 11 million person per year death rate. So that 1 in 5. To my knowledge, we're the only FDA qualified infectious disease designated company, which basically means we have 10 years of market exclusivity above and beyond our patent position. And we all know how valuable that can be, only starting from time of approval, plus fast track regulatory designation as part of that. That program is in a phase 1 intravascular study. In fact, about half to 3/4 of the way through that study, where we're really dose escalating to see how much patients can have from a safe perspective and whether the compound is well tolerated. Thankfully, all results to date have really put us in a good position for that. Running in parallel to that study is perhaps the more interesting, if I say it, or that eureka moment, as an Aussie would call it, of where you start to, in a topical burn wound study, see the efficacious potential of this compound. I mean, we can do it in animals. We've done it in animals for many, many years. But what we've really seen in a burn wound study led by former Australian of the Year, Professor Fiona Wood and Dr. Ed Rabi and colleagues, is a complete clinical response, utilising that same intravascular compound, spraying on the topical surface of wounds. They've had a complete cure in all cases, that being against gram-positive, gram-negative and superbug infections. So these 2 clinical candidates from our infectious disease portfolio are really leading the way and demonstrating as a platform technology that's with broad spectrum capability, because there's no such thing as good bacteria in the blood. There's only bad bacteria there, should it get in through breaking the skin, what may be possible. Through our preclinical suite of candidates, we have activity in Helicobacter pylori sinusitis, so administering through a different method of administration, as well as, your usual COVID candidates and similar. We wholly manufacture our product in Macquarie Park of Sydney, Australia, so we don't out-license that. In fact, the raw materials that we convert to an end product, it costs more the bottle than the materials that go in it. It's a very inexpensive process. We wholly own our intellectual property through 3, coming on 4 suites of intellectual property or patent suites out to November of 2037. And we're really at that exciting clinical stage where we start to see the news flow events through the hard work that we've put in and the significant capital we've invested over perhaps 10 years of development. Our top shareholders, of course, I mentioned I'm in there at number 2-ish. Fidelity Internet, well, actually, I'm not supposed to say who they are, but I'm pretty proud of them. So Fidelity International in there is number 3, as well as other large institutional investors. We are fully funded, we're caveat free, we wholly own our technology, and we're really on that path of commercialization, hoping to make antibiotic resistance history. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about myself, our company, and our path forwards, and we would certainly welcome any further questions. And who was next? I meant to introduce someone, I'm sorry. There we go. Mark Diamond of Antisense. I'm a little shareholder of yours, Mark, so please go ahead.
Thank you, James. I am very pleased to hear that you are a holder in Antisense, and I'm hoping as a consequence of the presentation today, we might be able to attract some more people onto the register. But firstly, it's my pleasure to be participating in the roundtable today. So good morning, good evening, as Sabine suggested, to all those that are on the call today. I'm Mark Diamond, Managing Director and CEO of Antisense Therapeutics. We're a Melbourne-based company. We're listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, but like Recce, we also have a listing on the Frankfurt exchanges. And so the company, as the name suggests, is focused on developing its pipeline of antisense therapeutics for rare diseases. And what we're looking at is developing our drugs for those diseases where there's a clear need for better therapy, but also where we expect our antisense drugs to profile as superior to not only the drugs that are on the market today to treat those diseases, but also those that are anticipated coming through development. For those who are unfamiliar with the antisense class of therapies, they are simply put chemically modified pieces of DNA. And as was highlighted earlier, the drugs work by targeting RNA, messenger RNA, to look to block the production of specific disease-causing proteins. And our antisense technology, we've accessed from the world leader in the field, a company called Ionis Pharmaceuticals. Now, Ionis are Nasdaq listed, market capped, I think now nearly $5 billion valuation. They have over 40 of these antisense therapeutic drugs in development with some of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, including GSK, Novartis, Bayer, Biotech, AstraZeneca. So Ionis have 3 now of these antisense drugs approved with regulatory authorities both in the US and Europe. One of those drugs partnered with Biotech for a rare muscle wasting disease of children, and you'll, I think, hopefully pick up the important link to our program. This drug called Spinraza is now selling in excess of $2 billion annually. So it is a technology that's generating massive revenue and interest in the market. And so we're very fortunate to be partnered with the world leader in the field and to be essentially accessing the same technologies as some of those biggest pharmaceutical players in the world. The lead drug that we're developing is a drug called AT1102. It's an antisense drug that inhibits the production of a protein called CD49D. This is a receptor on the cell surface of T cells. It's implicated in cell trafficking, and as a consequence, we know that inhibition of CD49D has a very potent effect on modulating inflammation in human disease. So we're developing our antisense to CD49D for a rare disease of children called Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Duchenne is known as a muscle wasting disease. Boys with Duchenne's, unfortunately, over time, progressively lose the muscle strength and function in their bodies. What we know of, there's about 40,000 boys with Duchenne's in both the US and Europe. So it has the unfortunate reputation of being the most common lethal genetic disease. And so the goal of therapy is to look to see if we can slow or halt this steady progressive loss of muscle strength and function. Today, the major focus in treating this disease is looking at the inflammation that's causing or driving this fibrosis in the muscles that leads to the muscle loss and function. Today, the only way that can be addressed is using a class of drugs first approved over 50 years ago called the corticosteroids. They're not particularly effective, and when used chronically like they need to be used in Duchenne's, cause some very substantial side effects. So we're looking at a better way of treating the inflammation in the muscles than the use of corticosteroids. As I said, it's the only way today available to treat these patients. The market is in desperate need for better therapies. As a consequence, it's projected to grow to as big as $10 billion by 2030, and I think that's a conservative estimate on the market potential in Duchenne's. Our drug AT1102 has established activity in a phase 2 clinical trial where we're able to show a benefit in being able to have improvement in the boys' upper limb strength and function. And so we're really excited about the next phase of development of the drug, which is a phase 2B3 study that we're planning to conduct in Europe. This would be what we call a registration study or a pivotal trial. So if the results were positive, we could move forward submitting that data to the European regulatory authorities for approval. So we sit potentially one study away from being able to market the drug in the second biggest pharmaceutical market in the world, with a compound that we've already shown very encouraging activity on key endpoints that would be monitored in this clinical study that we're running in Europe. So we're hoping that study will be up and running by the middle of this year. It puts us in rare company in the Australian landscape. There's only a handful of Aussie biotechnology companies that have drugs in phase 3 clinical development. So we're very excited to be leading the field, as it were, with a drug, as I said, that could see us through to an approval if we get positive data. Last point I'd like to make is that AT1102, because of its activity in dampening down inflammation in human disease. It really does have a broad application beyond Duchenne muscular dystrophy. We've got a couple of key collaborations running at the moment. We're running some animal studies at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute here in Melbourne, the biggest research institute investigating diseases of children in Australia. And we are testing our drug in novel indications, rare muscle disease indications in disease models. We're expecting that data to come through this year. And we also recently reported a very exciting collaboration with an expert in the US, a neurovirologist, who's been treating patients with long COVID. And we think H1102 has potential as an application in that disease. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg as we see it, as the opportunity to expand the application of H1102. So we, as I said, we think we're at a really important juncture with the development of our drug. We're excited about the news flow that's going to emerge not only around our Duchenne's program, but around expanding the drug's use into these other disease indications. And we're excited for our shareholders about the value creation potential that will flow. So thank you. As James suggested, very happy to take any questions from the audience today, or follow-up emails if that was appropriate. Thanks very much. So I think I'm to hand over to Mark if I'm not correct, and I hope I haven't gone over time, Mark, so apologies if I have.
No worries, no worries. Thank you, Mark. Quite exciting, obviously, and good morning, good afternoon also from my end. My name is Mark Vogt, CEO and Executive Director of Immutep. Immutep is a listed biotech company on the one hand side on the ASX and then also on Nasdaq. And we are focusing on immuno-oncology and autoimmune diseases. We are globally active, so our headquarters is in Sydney, but we have subsidiaries in Germany, in France, and in the United States. We have the worldwide leadership position in terms of LAG-3, lymphocyte activation gene 3, which is an immune checkpoint. And immune checkpoints are one of the most exciting and so-called hottest areas in biotech overall, and have been leading to a paradigm shift the way oncology and different cancer indications are being treated today. We have practically in the field 2 approved and validated checkpoints. One is called PD-1 with multi-billion-dollar blockbuster drugs like Keytruda or Opdivo. And we have CTLA-4 in 2011, PD-1, 14, 15, and now in 21, 22, actually LAG-3 has been validated, and we'll see from Bristol-Myers Squibb very likely the first approved drug. PDUFA date from the FDA is 19th of March. So it's a quite exciting, very evolving field. And Immutep has more programs around LAG-3 than anyone else, including the big pharmaceutical industry. However, we believe the big pharmaceutical industry is, of course, very, very important, and it's a kind of natural customer for biotech. So we have different collaborations with the industry. So we have, for instance, license agreement for 2 of our programs with Novartis and GSK, one in oncology, the other one in autoimmune diseases. And for our flagship program, eftilagimod alpha, we are collaborating with companies like Merck US, Merck Germany, or Pfizer, and in China, EOC Pharma. So we have a pretty global setup also in terms of our partnerships, and I believe it's important that you pass multiple due diligences and that you talk with your customers. So the LAG-3 space is moving forward, and we are playing, I believe that's fair to say, an important role there. We are active in clinical development. We have a registration-relevant clinical trial in first-line head and neck cancer ongoing. We are planning for another phase 3 in metastatic breast cancer. We are active in non-small cell lung cancer, first-line, second-line, and in a number of other solid tumors. And if you look at the data and the treatments we are doing, we double what you would historically expect with, for instance, Keytruda, when we combine eftilagimod together with Keytruda in a variety of different indications. So that's all I believe, quite exciting. And also the year 2022 will be, from a fundamental point of view, I put the macro environment aside for a second, will be very exciting. So we will see more LAG-3 data, and data in our business is, of course, decisive. We will see data from our studies. So for instance, TACTI-002 will report data in second-line non-small cell lung cancer, end of March, beginning of April at ESMO Lung. We are going to publish data in first-line non-small cell lung cancer, also in first half of this year. So a variety of different data points. And also, and this is important to mention here, we are coming with a very strong balance sheet. So we have no desire to go back to the market anytime soon. So we are in a very good and solid position and can move forward. But I shouldn't take too much of the time, especially as we are facing Q&A. But first of all, over to Mohit.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Mark. Good morning to everyone in Germany. Good afternoon in Australia. So my name is Mohit Chaya, and I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO of the company Bellaseno. So we are a German-Australian company, and our focus is using the body's regenerative potential for regrowing tissues. So it's the field of regenerative medicine. So today, when you have a soft tissue defect or a bone defect because of cancer, an accident, or a congenital deformity, the way the surgeon most likely fixes it is using a permanent prosthesis. They're made out of metal, silicone, or some other plastic. So they're called permanent, but in reality, the longer they stay in the body, the more issues they cause. So a good example is silicone implants, where more than half of the patients would need a replacement, every 5 or 10 years. So we are solving this problem by creating an absorbable scaffold using 3D printing, which helps the tissue regrow inside the body. So the scaffold is a lot like a construction scaffold that you would have seen probably on the way to the office this morning. It supports the body, provides a template and a framework for tissues to grow. And after 1-2 years, when the tissue is mature, the scaffold is then safely absorbed inside the body. So we developed this technology over the last 10 years, starting in Australia at the Queensland University of Technology. The first program we had was on breast scaffold for breast cancer patients, which is already in the clinics for the last 2 years. The first patients are now approaching 2 years time point, and we were able to show a regeneration of 350 milliliters of volume, which, as far as I know, is the biggest volume ever shown in the field. And our focus now is to expand the pipeline to also include the sectors of orthopedics and trauma, where our co-founders also have a huge amount of experience and preclinical data sets. And so on. So yeah, I mentioned before, Australia is very important for us, not only because for the German speakers, it's our Heimat. We were born there, although we are zu Hause in Leipzig. So we also have a subsidiary over there, which runs all the clinical trials. And we are hoping to expand our presence by setting up new manufacturing facilities, full end-to-end GMP certification, and also in the future manufacture scaffolds from there. So very exciting time point for us, having passed the preclinical to clinical hurdle. And now we're looking forward to, as Mark mentioned before, data is very important. So that is our next goal in here. So glad to be here. Thank you, Pedro and Lucia, for the invitation, and looking forward to the Q&A. Over to you, Lucia.
Thank you, Mohit. So yeah, so my name is Lucia Santos. So I started actually being active in the biotech scene back home at the time in Australia as I worked for Biotech in 2006, and now I've been in Germany since 2014, and as Sabine said, I'm business development for Cytel, which is a biometric service provider. And I'm very, very honored to be moderating this. Now, if I could ask the all participants, we're very happy that you are here, and we would love to actually have a bit more interaction. And if you don't mind having your cameras on, then we could actually like talk to each other. And just a little, again, reminding you of housekeeping. I try my very best to actually see people raising their hand up, but really to ensure that I see your questions, if you could send them to me as co-host, and I will read it out to the panelists. Now, to start with the question, actually, we have had a number of questions from you all as you registered, and there is since we have such a myriad of companies from Australia and German point of view who are active in both continents, we'll start then with this question on what is Australia's perspective on biotech ecosystem in Europe and vice versa. So I think this is probably a question that a lot of you could answer. Some of you who actually do have activities in both countries how would we start this? Mark Voigt, would you like to start? Because you have actually offices in both countries.
Yes, indeed, that's true. And I believe from the German perspective, it's fair to say that the Australian biotech ecosystem is very active. One tends to list earlier from a, let's say, IPO perspective compared to German companies. One is very active in clinical development. So Australia as a country is actually on a relative basis more active in clinical development, so different clinical trials than Germany. So you have excellent science over there, a lot of innovations, partly from my perspective, and I've been in venture capital before, partly there is a missing link, it seems, from very early stage, so seed concept, to really get then up to speed and find some growth capital if you're private. And this might be also one of the reasons why the listings are happening sometimes historically earlier. In Germany, you have also an active biotech scene, which has been underfunded, also compared to Australia, and there are cultural differences I can talk about in a second. Since years, it's changed because of the pandemic and because we had companies like Biotech or CureVac listing, interestingly, on the Nasdaq, not in Germany. So where more funding has been flowing into the sector. And of course, also in Germany, you have very good science, and there are also German-Australian success stories. I think some of them we know. But if I look at the public equity markets in Australia, to trade shares, for instance, to invest based on the superannuation, so the pension system, let's say, is significantly higher compared to Germany. Germans tend to be more conservative, so invest less in publicly listed companies, and there are stats that it will take a while until we catch up. So both ecosystems are very interesting. Both have been contributing to the field, and we really enjoy as Immutep working in both fields.
Thank you, Mark. Anyone from the panelists would like to add to that?
I'd simply add, hi, James Graham, Recce Pharmaceuticals here. I'd add the significant patient populations that exist in Germany and surrounding countries are very attractive to little Australian companies. The local domiciliation that a Frankfurt listing provides with its interconnectivity through to the Australian stock exchanges, perhaps the primary listing, gives a localized input from a capital markets perspective, whilst a significant patient population and large pharmaceutical companies are headquartered in the region. I mean, by example, I particularly think of Merck MSD, among others that are particularly pertinent and active in the infectious disease landscape. That being said, Australia is a place of innovation and technology. Our 43.5% R&D rebate that exists traditionally for companies' activities only here. But certainly in our instance, we have that extended to activity anywhere around the world, including Germany. And that might not be dissimilar to a number of other companies here, but it is a rare treat to access those patient populations and advance a compound when it's at that correct stage internationally and beyond. There ain't a lot of pharmaceuticals in Australia, we can put it that way.
Big Pharma, there's, yeah, that's TSL, then probably not many others. You were right. Yeah. But actually, thank you for actually gliding the discussion into clinical trials, because there is a number of questions in there. And actually, before going into trials, then how do we actually then, before we start the trials, how do we overcome different regulatory requirements? And perhaps Mark Diamond has something there to say.
No, thanks, Lucia. Yes, so we have had obviously relevant experience in working through the regulatory environment in Europe with regard to setting up for our phase 2b/3 study, as I mentioned earlier, for the boys with Duchenne. So we initiated our interactions through direct discussions with the national authorities at I think with BfArM, we went to MHRA, and then we also had interactions with the Dutch authorities. So we took the opportunity through the scientific advice that was offered as a way of being able to get the agency's views or insights on our planned study as the first step to start to develop up our protocol. We then went to the European Medicines Agency after having had that feedback from the national authorities with a similar sort of set of questions, but directed to the overarching body. And that was a really helpful exercise for us as well too. We went a further step as well too in our interactions with the European regulatory authorities. Because we're developing a drug for paediatric application, we need to have approved what's known as a paediatric investigational plan. So we are required by the European Medicines Agency to have outlined all of our intended studies in children and to have that pre-approved by the agency before we go and submit for marketing authorization. So, I guess our perspective would be it's a transparent process with the agencies. We found it very interactive. We found that the regulatory authorities in each level of those interactions to be supportive, helpful in giving advice on how we could move our programs forward. We didn't feel that at any time that we were running into obvious bureaucracy. So I'd have to say that our experience has been a very positive one. And I think through that we've come away, we believe, with a study design that has been optimized, and clearly the confidence of moving forward with this study now, having had all that input in from the agency, that if we do deliver the trial results, we could look to move forward with making an application for approval. So yeah, I'd only suggest that from our perspective, that it's seen as being a positive one, streamlined process, and that it's something that shouldn't be feared.
Thank you, Mark. I think actually with Mohit or James or Mark has actually also further to say. You also run trials in both countries, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to add. I agree with everything that Mark said. Having a clear communication line with the authorities early on is very important. So we work obviously in the field of medical devices, and I mean Europe is in the middle of changing the complete regulation from the medical device directives to the medical device regulations. And there's a lot of knowledge that is to be gained also by the authorities and the notified bodies and so on. So in that sense also, it helps to make sure that whatever designs that you come up with are going to be acceptable for the authorities as you move forward. Now, in our experience, I mean, there's a lot of hurdles for a company from R&D to market. But one of the big ones is moving from the preclinical into the clinical stage, especially for a new technology that has not been seen yet before. So in this sense, even though the regulatory authorities are very strict for good reasons everywhere, we found Australia, as James also mentioned, to be very innovation friendly. The clinics over there, the ethics committees, and also the TGA have been very engaging with us to have dialogues on a high level, to design not just the protocols, but also help us with the with the entire development plan through to market. So in our experience, I think Australia as a clinical development site has been really fruitful for us, but of course also from a manufacturing perspective as well. So where the government is giving a lot of incentives these days for manufacturers to set up the manufacturing sites within Australia. So it's this combination of manufacturing and clinical development that we see as a key factor that Australia brings to the community.
Maybe to briefly add from my end. So in oncology, indeed, in Australia, study startup, including regulatory interactions, it's fairly easy also compared to Germany, where you have the so-called Strahlenschutz, so radiation protection and things like that. So Australia, phase 1, early phase 2, and as James or Mark said, when you have larger patient populations, of course, you need to go global. That's pretty clear. So Australia is really good. The German competent authorities, BfArM or Paul-Ehrlich Institute, could be, let's say, a little bit more discussion or opinionated here and there. There could be some more discussions. That's not untypical. So a little bit higher bureaucratic burden, I would say. But of course, if you do studies in different European countries, then the EMA comes into play with the different harmonized procedures. And globally, of course, you have to also look at the FDA. This is the largest market at the end of the day, but also fairly expensive, to be quite fair.
Thank you, Mark. Now, actually, this comes to another question that comes, which is, so how easy is it to conduct trials actually then in Germany or other European countries? And compared to the US, as you just mentioned, and US is a big country, big market. And yeah, I suppose also compared to Australia, Australia is, you all said that it's relatively straightforward. That you run a few trials, I think, in the different countries. Probably you'd like to say a little bit more what your experiences are.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's not a problem, and we actually prefer to run our studies in 3 different geographies, being Australia, different European countries like UK, Germany, France, Netherlands, Belgium, Poland, what have you, and the United States. But of course, in the study startup phase, it means that you have, let's say, certain differences when the actual countries come on studies and when you initiate the sites, and you have partly significant cost differences. I believe James mentioned already the Australian R&D tax incentive. You have a similar program now also in Germany since 2020 called Forschungszulage, more complicated. And when it comes to cost per patient, clearly the US is much more expensive when you need to pay, for instance, oncology for a CT scan, $2,000. In Germany, very often this is publicly reimbursed. So you see with this little topic already quite big differences. So I would say from a regulatory point of view, there are also different, let's say, centers of gravity in terms, do they look a little bit more specifically in manufacturing or in sponsor risk and clinical development. But overall, it's feasible, and many companies are doing that, of course, to conduct trials in the different geographies, but you would expect always a delay in terms of who is coming on study next.
Thank you. Any further comments from Mark, Mohit, or James?
Maybe, Alicia, I would, concur with everything that Mark highlighted. One interesting distinction between Australia and Europe when contemplating conducting clinical trials is that, in Australia here, most clinical trials are approved through an ethics committee submission. So you're not looking at a specific submission to the regulatory authorities. So to some extent, that is perceived to be an easier path, a more straightforward path. It's definitely one that requires less documentation. Let's say that, And so, look, I think it probably is. It is a difference that does, facilitate faster startup in my experience, of studies here in Australia versus in Europe. But ultimately, once you've got your application into, BFARM, however you're running it, if it's a European study, whether you're filing, directly into the European mutual recognition process or like, once you've got those approvals, it doesn't seem to me to be, a real distinction, about how the studies are run, with the exception of the points that Mark made around maybe difference in cost. But, was highlighted earlier, I think James said, the advantage, of course, that you have going into Europe is the larger patient populations. And that's why all of us, at some point in time, need to contemplate, moving the clinical programs offshore into the bigger markets. And for us with a rare disease, indication, even more critical to be able to access, sufficient patients to be able to satisfy regulatory authorities around the safety database, for instance, that you're developing.
Most definitely. Thank you, Mark. Does Mohit or James had something further to add to this topic of ease of starting clinical trials in across both countries?
We're just starting ours in our activity, particularly from a clinical aspect in Europe. We're very nicely advanced in Australia, but it's that stepping stone into Europe that I take a lot of value from these comments in the background here. So I'm a listener in this one.
And Mohit?
Yeah, no, I think all this highlights the importance from the very beginning of the global clinical trial strategy that looks just at not just at the patients, but also in our case moving forward, reimbursement and so on, right? So every country has a different reimbursement mechanism, and it's very important that the maybe not the earlier stage trials, but the later stage trials also takes into account which markets are more interesting from a reimbursement point of view, right? And having done some studies there with endpoints which really reflect the cost benefit analysis. So that's what I would like to add to that story as well.
Thank you, Mohit. Now from clinical trial and moving into financing. So some of you are listed in many countries, and two of you then particularly three of you. Do you have dual listings in ASX and in Frankfurt or Nasdaq? Would you be able to share what are the advantages or disadvantages of dual listing? Does this really help you get extra investor base, please?
I've got this one. Finally, a question I can take. Sorry, guys. I love business. Our product just happens to be a pharmaceutical. So for me, this is a topic that I can definitely engage with. What it really does is, obviously, it opens up the capital markets, and frankly, the Frankfurt Exchange may well just be that stepping stone beyond, not necessarily for better or worse, but just beyond. Typically, Australian companies would get to a stage over here where they'd really peak or mature in the amount of venture in their capital, because there ain't a lot of venture in Australian capital. Peak or mature in as much of investments in the pharmaceutical landscape that may be. And as they step out into those larger patient populations and bigger capital markets, they try to go to Nasdaq or heaven forbid, the New York Exchange. I see the Frankfurt Exchange being a positive step for two reasons. One, a nice stepping stone onto those bigger capital markets without jumping too wide and too broad. But also, I really like the direct capital access or the ease of market hedge that it provides for both company and investor. The instance with our listing on the Frankfurt Exchange, by example, is it's not mirroring securities, it's trading of direct securities. So I really like, and I shouldn't give it away too much, but if we see what in our overnight is trade on the Frankfurt exchange, in essence, I think that they're selling our shares, well, they are selling our shares at often a premium price. And when they come back to the main exchange the next day to pick them up to offset the purchasing that may have occurred, you get an indirect appearance of an institutional investor purchasing at market, because obviously having sold it at premium, they can lift the price and still make a profit in that arbitrage. So for us, creating scarcity around the actual securities available by opening up the international capital markets to channel through that mechanism is a fantastic way to communicate whilst boosting the capital opportunities for shareholders and company alike. So as you can tell, I'm pretty passionate about the topic, but it's a really wonderful stepping stone above and beyond the traditional Australian listing.
Mark Voigt, you just unmuted yourself. You wanted to add to
Yeah,
that.
indeed. It's of course great to be dually listed, not for the sake of just having two listings. With Nasdaq, and I'm sure this is also true for the German listing. You have access to additional investors, but of course it also comes with a little bit of a burden. So for instance, we need to comply with the SEC as well with ASIC. So you have two regulatory agencies, Security Exchange Commission. So you have filing costs, for instance. You need to be able to entertain both markets. We have a number of institutional investors in Australia, of course, in Hong Kong, in the United States, also in Europe, for instance, Medical Strategy out of Germany, or Fidelity, or BlackRock, or Perennial in Australia, Australian Ethical, and so on and so forth. So it's good. At a certain point in time, we are now about 10 years dually listed, so we have a bit of experience. But you need to be organization-wise prepared for that step. And you need to really entertain both markets. And we have been starting not with an IPO, but really with a listing, so without a capital injection, in April 2012. And we had just a very tiny amount at the beginning of stock traded in the US. So we had maybe 0.5%, 2% of our shareholding in the US. Now we have 30%, and it's very substantial and liquidity, but it took time. It comes with a cost. And with a lot of efforts, but we are welcoming that. But we are also, by the way, listed OTC in Germany. This is done by brokers, so it's not an active listing, but we are listed OTC in Germany as well. And the markets have, of course, different specifics, but both Germany, US, and of course also Australia are very interesting.
Thank you. I think Julia wants to say something about that.
You saw that I got unmuted. I mean, as Mark already mentioned, so we have a lot of German biotech companies who went to Nasdaq. And I would be interested, what was your intention or decision not to go to Nasdaq? So for James and Mark, preferring Frankfurt. So as I already said, I think this is very good news, because we always have this argument that we have two less biotech companies listed at the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. If you can
go for it, Mark. I think your reasons will be very similar to mine.
For you, Mark. So yeah, James, brother. Yeah, thanks, Julia. I'd only sort of comment on that would be that, and Mark Voigt did allude to this, is that the cost differential for setting up and maintaining a Frankfurt listing versus a Nasdaq listing are significantly different. So when we say significant, my understanding, and Mark would be better to speak to this, but to set up and maintain compliance, we're talking hundreds of thousands, possibly $1 million, to ensure that you are compliant. And whereas with Frankfurt Exchange, it was really a minimal entry cost. And the other benefit is that we don't have to generate any different regulatory documentation, so that the listing really is available to us because we're listed on the ASX. So as long as we're compliant with our ASX listing, we do all the disclosures that we're required to do, we're able to maintain our Frankfurt listing. So from my perspective, I think that, like James said, we see this as a sort of an initial stepping stone outside of our ASX. It's, what we think, one that reflects the sort of size of the company where at the moment, but also where our major activities are going to be operated, which is in Europe. So that was a main driver for us, moving to the Frankfurt Exchange. We do have ambitions like Mark, where Mark's got to, of listing on Nasdaq. We have seen a number of Australian companies attempt that, but unfortunately, perhaps hasn't gone as successful as they would hope for. And there's been a view that maybe the companies went too early, didn't have the sort of critical mass or the story, to be able to justify moving to a Nasdaq and to get the requisite interest. So we're monitoring it always very carefully, but we really, are pleased with having had this sort of first step into the Frankfurt listing. I have to thank James for it, because James, I had a discussion with James and got his advice on, or his views on how this was helping his business. And so I'm really pleased that we moved that way. And so I'll let James jump in now and talk further on it, because he has more requisite experience.
Oh, thank you, Mark.
Sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to comment flattering, and I really appreciate it, and have been so enthused, not only as a spectator, but as a little shareholder, to participate in the upside I saw for your business. If it helps, and in the context of your aspirations of US listing, I'm actually personally moving to the United States to live there for the purposes of broadening our two US listing aspirations. So maybe, I don't know, it could be a race between us who can get there first, but at the right time, hopefully I'll have the next stage of mateship advice on that one. We'll see.
We're very interested to see which one of you just get there first. But it's interesting to hear. I didn't know this. Is actually, so Frankfurt, and the entry requirements or regulatory requirement for Frankfurt is a lot less onerous, so than the US. So that would be, so you
on the ASX, they see that as good corporate governance, and as long as you achieve ASX governance, that they'll accept that.
So would that be like a message to Australian biotechs that Frankfurt Stock Exchange is a good stepping stone?
I don't know, keep the capital for our businesses. We don't want to dilute the pool too much. I think we're doing okay. Yeah. But look, it's been a fantastic, expensive step.
Maybe only short. I mean, the difference is that it's yours is to do it, the second listing, yes, and the German companies are the ones who are addressing Nasdaq. They tried there to get into to get more money than as a via IPO than in Frankfurt. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I think this is such an exciting discussion, and the time just ran away. And it's actually already at least 9 o'clock in Europe, 7 o'clock in Australia. Actually, Perue, could I ask you to...
Yes, I'll step in to do the vote of thanks, Lucia. So on behalf of the German-Australian Business Council, as well as our corporate member, DGWA, I would like to thank our panel of experts, Julia, Mark Voigt, Mark Diamond, James Graham, and Mohit Chaya, for their valuable insights, which clearly not only included Germany and Australia, but has now moved to the US. So maybe we'll bring in our US counterparts to join the next discussion. And a big thanks to our moderator, Lucia, and our participants as well for the lively and on-point discussion. If you're interested in keeping updated with German-Australian business relations, I encourage you to join the German-Australian Business Council as a member and also attend our events. Our next event will be on Tuesday, 29th of March, presented in collaboration with our ABBY organization, our fellow ABBY organization, the Australia-French Business Association. It will be an economic roundtable, very similar to this, but it will discuss the sustainability transition in Europe and opportunities for Australia. And we would have keynote speakers, Professor Christoph Schmidt, who's president of the Leibniz Institute for Economic Research, and Professor Christian Golia, who's from the Toulouse School of Economic. So more details are available on our website, gabc.eu. Thank you all once again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at our future events. Have a good day, evening, wherever you are. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, GABC, for organizing. Bye-bye.